right. Hey, class, how's it going? So here we are, Unit 12. All right, Unit 12. We have a lot of stuff to talk about. This is post World War II. I know we kind of jumped over World War II early in this unit in the course content. You're going to be watching some of the impacts of the war as far as the dehumanization and the impacts from the dropping of the first atomic bombs and what that meant to society. And that we're going to move from those things into how this creates an existential worldview and what that means and what does it mean for the absurd and looking for causality and meaning in life, those sorts of things. Big post World War II questions. So let's just take a look real quick here at the historical components, the historical implications. So, post World War II or during World War II, there was a massive amount of civilian casualties, as we talked about in the last unit, this notion of total war, where civilians and modes of production were brought to the forefront of the battlefield, largely in part due to aerial bombardments of, using various weapons. But this creates a world where after, much like the lost generation after World War One, post World War II, people are asking some pretty complicated questions after the extremity of bloodshed and death. We also have in mixed into this, unlike World War One, World War One really rattled everyone's cages, but after World War II, there was an even larger issue, and that had to do with the advent of the nuclear era and the possibility for total um, an end of total end of civilization. And so this created a lot of questioning in the survivors of World War II. So, let's just do a little timeline. I brought this up before in the past, but I just want to remind that. So if we get to, let's say we end up in, I'm just going to say 1950s America right here. And this is a global phenomenon and impacting Europe. But for this particular unit, we're going to be looking at a lot of American elements in here. And if you go back, the war started in 1940 for the United States, or a little bit after that, but we'll just use 1940 as a rough date. Ends in 1945, would be the end of the war. And then we go back to 1929. 1929, the stock market crash, and we have the depression. So let's say that you were born, and you go to war, or you enlist in the military in 1940, and let's just say hypothetically, and obviously there's going to be a lot of variation here, but you were born in 1920. You lived through this period as a young person. You lived through the depression. You then move in your 20s into World War II, and you come out of the war in, let's say, your early to late 20s, and you have just lived through this incredibly difficult period. Now, the first part of your life in the roaring 20s would have been pretty simple, but it quickly would have gotten far more complex. And so your entire youth revolved around true human struggling, and I mean, of a magnitude most of us can't, in a contemporary sense, can't quite relate to. And when I say individually, I know even today, obviously, lots of individuals have very, very challenging lives for a variety of reasons. But this was an entire demographic, an entire period of people who had a very challenging youth. And so existentialism is going to be a philosophy that comes out of that era. And that existentialism is going to be questioning the meaning of life after you've, some of these people would fight in the Pacific. Others would be freeing um, concentration camps and marching across Germany. Others would be serving in hospitals across the battlefield. And at the home front, women would be working in factories in the largest numbers ever seen in the American workforce. There were major changes. And this would create people to ask, what's the meaning of life? What's the purpose here? And after you come to you know, the realization that humankind now has the capacity to, through nuclear annihilation, to basically end civilization as we know it, maybe not all life, but civilization as we know it, that question of meaning becomes even more concerning because for the very first time, due to industrialization, mechanization, modernization, humankind has a godlike power of destruction. And this creates a lot of complex philosophical questions that are going to permeate the next 50 years. I would say from 1950 all the way up until present day, even more than 50 years. We're still wrestling with this power. And now, we have artificial intelligence, we have genetic modification and genetic engineering. We throw on the continued militaristic capabilities of doing massive amounts of damage. So there's a lot of what's the meaning of all this? At the same time, because American cities had not been bombed, American railroads, American infrastructure had not been bombed, like all of the rest of the modern world. And when I say modern world, in this context, I mean technologically advanced world. American prominence was a natural byproduct. We had factories, we had railroads, we had shipping lanes, and financially speaking, we came out with quite a bit more money. We came out of the war in a much better economic and industrial situation than the rest of the world did. So, obviously, what happened during this time period? Massive economic success in the United States. And it would last through the 1970s. The United States would be doing very well. And this is going to lead to, some of you have heard, the baby boomer generation. And so these are all the people, baby boomers, all the people born in this period from 1945 into the early 1960s. This is going to be the baby boom generation, the post-war, the children born in this post-World War II United States. And this is going to lead to, because of our factories and our, the industrialization that occurred during World War II, this is going to fuel a rise in consumer culture. We're going to finish electrifying. The electricity grid is going to become more widespread in rural America, which up until this point it still was, growing. We're going to build the interstate highway system. There's the highways, which is going to fuel trade, although it was in large part built for Cold War in order to move troops around the country. It's also going to greatly help with this economic success. And then we're going to have the advent of the television, which is going to lead to a new iteration, a visual iteration of pop culture. And this is going to lead to eventually into what we'll look at as pop art. And so there's going to be this split in society. So many of these young people went to war or were very directly impacted the war, even if they weren't there. Their lives were totally upended by the Depression in World War II. And so there's going to be this somewhat of a dichotomy or a duality, a split in American culture where there's going to be one bent who lend themselves towards anti-authoritarianism, meaning they're going to want no central authorities. They are going to trust no governments. They, when we look at communism and fascism and all of the complexities of politics in the politicization of art in the lead up to World War II, there's going to be a whole group of people that say, I don't want any of that. whatsoever. I want to find my own meaning, and I don't want anyone else telling me what things mean or what I should do. And so this is that anti-authoritarian streak. And then there's going to be another group of people who look at this chaos that's created during this period, this global chaos, and all they want is a very simple, conservative, stable life. So they want simple and stable, where everybody knows all of the rules and everybody follows all of the rules. And over here, so these people want rules, and this is a generalization. These people want rules, and these people want no rules whatsoever. And so, as we look to 1950s America, we have this divide starting. And this divide, I would say, continues to influence contemporary politics pretty substantially. And so this is the segment, the Leave It to Beaver 1950s, white picket fence, the nuclear family. You have a mother who stays home, the father who goes to work every day, and they come home and they have dinner together and they talk about moral quandaries. And life is quite simple. On the flip side, you have the Beat Generation, and a generation of people who come back from the war and they say, you know what? There is this Cold War, and we have all of these nukes out there, and I could die at any minute due to the whims of these political elites. And you know what? I'm going to live like I might die tomorrow. And I don't care about any of the structures and the rules of society. They're all garbage. I'm going to make up my own rules. And so we get this counterculture, which is going to be referred to as the Beat Generation. We're also going to have, the Beat Generation will be a bunch of literary folks, at least initially. But then you also see the creation of, kind of rebel bordering on criminal elements like the Hells Angels. And the Hells Angels, I don't know if you know, but the Hells Angels were originally they were paratroopers. They were veterans from World War II who were paratroopers, and they called Hells Angels because of the white parachutes that they would descend onto the battlefields in Europe using. And they came back and they created a biker gang, and it was sex, drugs, rock and roll. I just went to the war and I didn't think I was going to live to see the end of the war. And now here I am. And you want me to live this Leave It to Beaver life that I believe has no intrinsic meaning? Are you kidding me? I'm going to get a fast motorcycle. I'm going to get drunk. I'm going to have sex. I'm going to do all sorts of things that society says I shouldn't do. And you can't tell me that doesn't have, I can't make my own meaning out of that. The Beat Poets are going to include elements of jazz and blues into the rhythms of their spoken language or spoken poetry. And this is going to be beat poetry, coffee shop poetry, bar poetry, that sort of thing. And as you can see, this symbol up here, one way, this is a big irony. This is a famous photo from the beat era suggesting that there's only one way. And they're going to say, no, there's not just one way to live. The simple conservative life of the 1950s, and they're going to rebel against that. We're going to see that in art, literature, music, and all of this, which is really going on in the late 40s and the 1950s, will lead to and shape what will become known as the hippie generation in the 1960s, the nonconformity, the anti-establishment, the anti-consumer society is all going to have its philosophical grounding back here in the 1950s when the United States is really trying to figure itself out in this post-war era. It's also going to include there's going to be, obviously, we're moving towards the 1960s where we start to see issues surrounding civil rights are going to pop up. the role of women in the household is going to start to shift, especially post-war. Many women, or pre during the war, many women went to work. Post-war, they lost those jobs, and then in the years after, they're going to be wanting those jobs back in a large part. So this whole period is in leading into the 1960s is going to be framed by these existential questions about what does life mean? And existentialists like Sartre are going to have pretty concrete philosophies that you'll explore in the unit about that. So then, as you can see here, these are some of the 1950s counterculture, that some of the things that they're going to start to question. So the beat generation is about a generation who's been beat down, and they're beat up. And the beat down and beat up aspect of this generation is a byproduct of those historical components I mentioned: the Depression, the war, a lot of them having very direct experiences with those very historically challenging times. And so there's going to be this pretty concrete anti-military industrialism. These people who went to war, they were a part of it, and now they see the Cold War popping up, and they say this is just more insanity. Like, we just saw the most insane example of human behavior in World War II, and now you all want to build a bunch of nuclear weapons? Like, how does that lead to anything beneficial for humanity? So they're going to be pretty anti-military industrial, total embrace of living life. There's going to be a challenge to authority, pushing back against any centralized authority, because according to this counterculture philosophy, it was that centralized authority, that fascist authority, under Hitler and Stalin and Mussolini, who led to this very violent period of time. And so they're going to say, you know what? Most of the times when authority pops up, it's not a good thing. And so they're going to also lead to this anti-consumerism, that meaning does not come from consumer goods, but meaning comes from experiences. And so many of these young people are going to get in cars, they're going to go on adventures, and they're going to jump out into life seeking to find their own meaning and constantly looking for it. We're going to see this in abstract expressionism, stream of conscious writing. Jack Kerouac is going to write On the Road, where he goes, literally, this is based on real events. He goes on these series of these road trips. And on the road, he doesn't write it on the road, he writes it after the fact. But he writes the entire book on one single roll of paper, no paragraphs, just stream of conscious. And that's going to become a popular form of writing, because in that stream of consciousness, that stream of authenticity, that stream of meaning investigation, is where the artist will believe that they can find some sense of meaning. Everything is going to be experimental, from drugs and sex to music. And there's going to be, I already put this, consumerism, critique of consumerism, which you'll see, like in the Andy Warhol, the pop art. So, very turbulent philosophical period, which we often see after a war. There's a real sense of searching for what do things mean after, uh, you know, people see really experience dire things. So they're the same people, only further from home. On freeways 50 lanes wide on a concrete continent spaced with bland billboards illustrating imbecile illusions of happiness. This is from Lawrence Ferlinghetti, and he was a really well-known beat poet at the time. All right. Last, this is Jean-Paul Sartre, and he is our existential philosopher who is going to be massively influential in creating a framework in which people are going to start to reconceive of the world. Because, after every series of historical events, new philosophies pop up that try to help people make sense of what they just saw, what they just experienced on a whole cultural scale, not as an individual, but as a whole culture. And so Sartre is going to say, this is a famous quote: Man is condemned to be free because once thrown into the world, he is responsible for everything he does. It is up to you to give life a meaning. So, obviously, a quote like this continues to piggyback off of modernism, where modernism is going to be questioning traditional forms of leadership and traditional forms of church authority and kind of all authority. And so the moderns are just going to question and say, I don't know about any type of authority, moral authority or political authority. And the existentialist, or the people who are now going to be referred to as postmodern. Postmodern has a lot of negative connotations in some philosophical circles, but that's postmodern world is going to say the only meaning that matters is the meaning that you create, not the meaning of the church, not the meaning of the government, not the meaning of your society, of your family, of your culture, but your own authentic meaning. And so some people see existentialism as very dark and hopeless because, there is no absolute meaning according to an existentialist. Other people see this as very freeing because it provides them the opportunity to explore and define their own meaning, which, of course, if everybody's defining meaning in a different way, that leads to postmodern relativism, which, if you study philosophy, has its own um, complexities and challenges, some of which we're dealing with right now. Some people refer to our current place in philosophy as a post-truth world. And if everybody is creating their own meaning, meaning is up to the individual. Then what does truth mean in a post-truth world? Right now, and it's a philosophical conundrum we'll move through. This is normal things that happen in society, but in a post-truth world, you constantly hear people saying, well, I don't know what to believe, I don't know what's true. And truly, this is the byproduct of existentialism. It's a byproduct of World War II. It's a byproduct of nuclear annihilation. And we'll move through this post-truth world. I don't know where we'll end up. Who does? But so we're still experiencing the conundrums of existentialism. And so, as I said, some people find this freeing and allowing for authentic self-discovery, and other people find that this creates a world totally lacking in concrete morals and truths. So it's an interesting place we live. All right, as always, let me know if you have any questions.